Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be showing you guys what is an observer design pattern, where it can be used, and how you can implement one on your own. So make sure to stick to the whole video in order to learn how observer design pattern works. Now in observer design pattern, your function can subscribe to events in your application. And those events can be anything from click events to change in data to AJAX call, anything. And whenever that event occurs, those functions who have subscribed to the event will get notified or will get called. Now, that is the core of how observer design pattern works. There are two main parts to observer design pattern. Now, as you can see on the screen, we have a subject that holds information about all the events, and then we have observers which have subscribed to that subject. So whenever an event occurs in subject will go ahead and notify all the observers that have subscribed to the event change in that subject. Now this is pretty much how observer design pattern works. Now two places where observer design pattern can be seen in action is the first one is DOM API. If you have ever attached click events to your buttons in your applications, that is pretty much observer design pattern behind the scenes. So you usually attach click event handlers by doing button.add event listener click, and then you pass the callback function. That callback function is the observer part. So what DOM API is doing behind the scenes is whenever that event occurs, the DOM API is keeping track of all the observers and it'll call that observer whenever that event occurs. The observer here is the callback that you pass to add event listener method. Now the second place where observer design pattern really shines is React library. Now if you have used React library, you might know that whenever there is a state change, React library will re-render the component. So what React library is doing behind the scenes is it's keeping track of all the observer or all the JSX that you are returning from the component, and whenever the state changes, React will go ahead and call render function behind the scenes to re-render your component. Now these are the two of examples that observer design pattern can be seen in action. Now I'll go ahead and show you guys how you can implement observer design pattern on your own so you can use it in your application. Now as you can see on the screen, I have super basic HTML here with 3 buttons and an input element, and then I have basic styling as well. And then for the JavaScript part, I've saved the reference to all these 3 buttons in these const variables, and then I have attached click handlers to all 3 buttons, but I've passed empty callbacks. They don't do anything right now. So we'll go ahead and implement the observer design pattern together. So the functionality that I want to achieve is, for example, whenever user types something in the input box, we will have a render function that will get subscribed to the subject, and whenever user adds a task, we will run that render function or notify that render function, and that render function will render a list of tasks on the screen. And then the subscribe and unsubscribe buttons are basically for that render function. So when we click on unsubscribe button, we will unsubscribe the render function, and when we click on subscribe button, we should subscribe the render function back to subject again. So we'll go ahead and currently they don't do anything here. So we'll go ahead and implement that functionality. So I will start with, I'll be using ES6 classes here. So I'll start with adding a class called subject, and then this class will have a constructor function. Now we want to keep track of all the tasks, and we want to keep track of all the observers in the subject class. So I'll add 2 properties to the subject class. So number 1 is task list, it's an array. And then number 2 is observers. Now these two properties will keep track of all the tasks and observers, and we'll add some methods that will be responsible for either subscribing or unsubscribing or notifying the observers. So the first method that I'll be adding is called notify all. Now what this function will do is it'll basically loop through all the observers and just call them with all the task list that we have. And then I'll add another method called subscribe, and the subscribe method will have a function as an argument. A function is basically the observer that we will pass to the subscribe function. So what this subscribe method will do is it'll push that argument function to the list of observers. So push the function that is getting passed. Now here we are using subscribe method to basically push the function that observer whichever we want to subscribe to this subject class. And then we will add another method called unsubscribe. Now this method will be basically responsible for unsubscribing observer from subject class. So what we want to do here is we want to reset the observers is not equal to function. This will basically get rid of the observer that we are passing here to unsubscribe, and then just keep all the other observers that are subscribed to the subject class. This is pretty much it for subject class. One more method that I have to add is called add task. Now this method will be responsible for pushing tasks to task list. So this dot push this dot task list dot push, and then we'll pass task name as a argument. This is pretty much it. So now what we want to do is we want to initiate that subject class so we can use all the different methods that are present on subject class. So I'll go ahead and do okay. Now I'll go ahead and add that render method that we were talking about. That render method will be responsible for rendering all the tasks on the screen in a list element. Now I have gone ahead and added this function called render task on screen. Now what this function basically does is we'll pass it the list of tasks, and it'll first initially make sure we don't have anything on the screen. So it'll set the container inner HTML to an empty, and then it'll loop through, and then it will loop through all the tasks and inject all the list items based on how many tasks that we have. Now what I want to do is I will subscribe that render tasks on screen function to the subject class. So the way to do that is this is pretty much it. Now we have subscribed this render tasks on screen function to subject class, but on its own it won't do anything because our task list is empty right now. So what we want to do is, now whenever user clicks on add task, we want to submit a task to this class, so it can be injected in this task list. So I've already added an event handler here. What I want to do is I want to get that input. I forgot the ID on that input. Yeah, so it's the ID is task input. So what I want to do is I will save a reference to that input element as document dot get element by ID task input. Awesome. Now if the input dot element dot value is not false, then we will basically go ahead and push that to subject class. Add task and input value, and after we want to clear the input as well. Okay, awesome. Now this should work as expected. We will add the functionality for these two buttons later. Now before I test this app, we want to make sure that we notify all the observers whenever a task is pushed onto the task list. So what I've done here is I've called this notify all method whenever a task is pushed to the task list. Okay. Now let's go ahead and test that functionality out. Let me refresh the window, the editor window, to make sure it compiles properly. Okay, so it is working as expected. The next thing that we want to do is we want to make these two buttons work. Okay, so for these two buttons, subscribe and unsubscribe button, what I want to do here is whenever a subscribe is clicked, I will subscribe the render task on screen method function to subject class, and whenever unsubscribe is clicked, I'll unsubscribe that function from the class. So let's go ahead and do that. First we'll make unsubscribe button work. So what was that class name? Task subject class, task sub dot task subject class dot unsubscribe, and I'll pass the function name now, render tasks on screen. And for the subscribe button, I'll subscribe that function to the class, subject class dot subscribe, and pass the function name, okay, save, and I will go ahead and refresh. One thing before I want to do is I'll get rid of this so we can subscribe the function on button click instead of manually doing it in JavaScript. So let's hit save. Okay, let's go ahead and test out the whole functionality now. So test one, I'll click on add task, As you can see, nothing is visible because we have not subscribed the render function to the subject class. So I'll click on subscribe now, and now if I add task 2, as you can see, now the function is subscribed to the class. So I can add task 3, task 4. Now if I click on unsubscribe, now the function is unsubscribed to that class. So if I add task 5, now keep in mind the tasks are still getting added, but they are not getting rendered on the screen. So let me add task 6. Now let me subscribe again by clicking subscribe button. Task 7. As you can see, all the tasks are showing up on the screen. Now this is pretty much how observer pattern works, as you can see on the screen. Now this is how observer pattern works. Your functions can subscribe to a specific class, and whenever those events occur, your function or observer will get called. I hope this video was super helpful to you guys. Please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys in the next one.